Good evening, church. Uh, Grateful again for the opportunity to be here this evening and to share some thoughts on some scriptures in God's Word. As I said this morning, this is going to be a continuation of looking at some different uh, instances in Scripture where they either make reference to a river or a river is involved that I think are good places to launch from for us to kind of look at how God's relationship with mankind progresses throughout history. And so, if you have your Bibles, you can go ahead and turn to Joshua chapter 24, and that will be where we spend most of our time this evening. I'm going to start in the middle, then we'll move our way back. I just want this thought to be on your mind as we read this. Um, because what we'll go back and read is all of the things that Joshua is going to use to build up for his challenge to the people. And so in Joshua chapter 24, beginning in verse 14, Joshua says, "Now therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Now we're going to look at the beginning of this speech, and we might venture back to chapter 23 as well, depending on how time is going. But we're going to look at Joshua in this speech, kind of traces the way in which God had changed his relationship with people in some kind of fundamental ways from where we left this morning. This morning we talked about Adam and Eve, and we talked about them being in the Garden of Eden, and the garden described as being surrounded by these four rivers, and how in that instance, in that point in time, there they were not separated from God, but because of their sin, they are removed from that. What we know throughout the next couple chapters there in Genesis is that, quite frankly, mankind didn't do so well once they were removed from there. Right? We read about a brother killing his brother. We read about the people gathering together to try to build a tower and being spread out. We read about, and I just realized I didn't put this in the right order, but I'm sure you'll forgive me, right? But we read about the fact that the populace was so filled with evil that God kind of sets a reset button, hits the reset button, and kind of starts over with Noah and the flood and all of the things that go into that. Basically, we read about how mankind does not do well in trying to do things on their own. People very quickly turn from God. And in Joshua chapter 24, we read about this instance, or we read about the history that God has with this special group of people. 24 verse 1, it says, "Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem and summoned the elders, the heads and the judges, and the officers of Israel. And they presented themselves before God. And Joshua said to all the people, 'Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, long ago your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates, Terah, the father of Abraham and of Nahor, and they served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from beyond the river and led him through all the land of Canaan and made his offspring many. I gave him Isaac And to Isaac I gave Jacob and Esau. And I gave Esau the hill country of Seir to possess, but Jacob and his children went down to Egypt. And I sent Moses and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt with what I did in the midst of it. And afterward I brought you out. It's interesting. I don't know if you recognize or remembered the Euphrates. It's a river that was referenced in a description of kind of what surrounded the Garden of Eden. And here we read Joshua repeating the history of the Israelite people, saying, Abraham, the father of your people, lived beyond this and was called to. Right? I called him up from beyond the Euphrates, and I said, we're going to a different place. And it's here with Abraham that God establishes a unique covenant with these people, the descendants of Abraham. It is to Abraham that he makes what I consider the three great promises that we read about in the Old Testament, right? We have the promise of the many people, the promise of the land, and the promise that all people will be blessed through your seed. It's through Abraham and his descendants that Joshua, in like 2 sentences, discusses hundreds and hundreds of years of history and how God led this special people into Egypt and then brought them out of Egypt. And remember, Joshua, the crowd that he is talking to are people who are perhaps, if he's talking to the ones who are the oldest in their society, perhaps people who were children at the time that they were originally leaving Egypt. By this point in time, maybe it's the children of those children. My point being, these are not people who are far removed from all of the great things that God did in that story of Exodus. People who would recognize that God had a special relationship with them. In verse 6, then I brought your fathers out of Egypt, and you came to the sea. And the Egyptians pursued your fathers with chariots and horsemen to the Red Sea. And when they cried to the Lord, he put darkness between you and the Egyptians and made the sea come upon them and cover them. And your eyes saw what I did in Egypt, and you lived in the wilderness a long time. Then I brought you to the land of the Amorites, who lived on the other side of the Jordan. They fought with you, and I gave them into your hand, and you took possession of their land, and I destroyed them before you. Then Balak, the son of Zippor, king of Moab, arose and fought against Israel, and he sent and invited Balaam, the son of Beor, to curse you. But I would not listen to Balaam. Indeed, he blessed you, so I delivered you out of his hand. And you went over the Jordan and came to Jericho. And the leaders of Jericho fought against you, and also the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And I gave them into your hand, and I sent the hornet before you, which drove them out before you, the 2 kings of the Amorites. It was not by your sword or by your bow. I gave you a land on which you had not labored, and cities that you had not built, and you dwell in them. You eat the fruit of vineyards and olive orchards that you did not plant. What I want us to notice in this description, that there are different periods of time that are marked by crossing certain points. As I briefly discussed this morning, you have the importance of bodies of water on the history of mankind and how we've moved around and how we relate to each other. You have here a description of Joshua explaining to these people what God had done for them. We see that there is a point in history in which the relationship that God had with a select group of people was different and unique. Now, if you go back and you read the story of Exodus and you read about the different instances of, even in the book of Joshua, as they conquer the promised land, that even though God had a unique relationship with the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham, it wasn't that God did not relate to others. We read about how even during the Exodus, that those Egyptians and those people who would have listened to what God said through Moses would have been spared if they followed the commandments that were given. We read about how Rahab can graft herself into the lineage of Jesus. See, even though God has a special relationship with this group of people, God did not stop caring about everybody else. But it was a unique period in time. Unique in the sense that God had established certain covenants with these people. When you look at the history of the Bible, it's broken up into several different periods. We have one period of history where it appears that the way in which God related his wishes to the people was through the heads of families, heads of clans, where God would communicate in a way to, this person is the head of this family. And there was a communication line through there, to the point where we have the Mosaic law, the covenant that God establishes. We have the covenant he establishes with Abraham. Again, those 3 promises. And we see this just traced through, where the way that God informs and instructs people changes. But again, even though it is change, even though there is a special group of people, God does not stop caring about those around him. It's interesting here to me. You have him discussing the Euphrates River and how he came across that point. You have him in verse 6 talking about how the Egyptians pursued the Israelites to the sea. You have them discussing how when they are about to reach the promised land, they have to cross the Jordan River, and how God works for them in all of these instances, to the point in which, in verse 13, he says, I gave you a land on which you had not labored, cities that you had not built. You eat fruit of vineyards and olive orchards that you did not plant. It is interesting to me. And again, I look at my life as an individual human being, and I recognize that as a Christian, I entered into a unique relationship with God. That when I became a Christian, I entered into a covenant relationship with God that was different than any relationship with God that a person can have that is outside of that. It is interesting to me that in the New Testament, Jesus alludes to the idea of a group being grafted into the vine. That even though what we read about here in Joshua is the establishment and the continuation of a special relationship with the Israelite people, that Jesus states that there will be a time, and that time is now, in which grafted into that relationship will be others. And that's us. we as Christians. See, I am a firm believer in the idea that when we are young, before we know right and wrong, before we are capable of doing that, that we find ourselves more or less in the same or similar situation of Adam and Eve before leaving the garden. But as sin enters our lives, we become separated from God. Much like you have the people who flee from God so much that God says it's time to reset this thing. Much like you have groups of people who become so confident in their own capabilities that they try to reach God through their own building prowess. And God says, no, that's not the way this is going to work either. I think through our lives, most of us go through periods of time between the point in which we recognize that we have sinned, where we kind of go multiple directions before we enter into a relationship with God. At least for me, I can recall times in my life in which I didn't really care all that much about what the Bible or what God had to say about what I was supposed to be doing. I grew up going to church on Sunday mornings with my grandparents. I grew up learning about the words of God. And there was a period of time when I was in middle school where I knew that there was right and wrong, and I knew that I found myself in the wrong, that I knew that I was a sinner, and I didn't care. Much like the people of Noah's time, who had been so evil, they rejected God so completely that God reset everything. Now, I count myself very lucky. That was a very short period of time for me. Very short period of time when I was in middle school, maybe a couple months, where I just didn't care at all. Then there was a longer period of time where I thought to myself, I am a sinner, but I will try to be good. I'll try to be the best that I can be. By my own goodness, I'll bridge that gap. I'll bridge that separation from God. Much like the people who tried to build a tower to reach God, they do it themselves. And then thankfully, I entered into an understanding of God that allowed me to realize that I needed to enter into a relationship with Him through baptism and have my sins washed away. And I recognized that at that point, I, as a Christian, had entered into a situation where there was a unique relationship with God. Not that God did not care about everyone else around us, around me, but that by entering into that, I had become a part of something that was unique and different from my non-Christian friends. See, God's relationship with the Israelites is a little bit different than that as Christians, in the sense that there was certainly some inheritance based upon your family heritage, where you came from. But it was not so much so that the Israelites could not choose whether or not they wanted to follow God. And hence you get the great challenge that Joshua gives that we all are so familiar with in Joshua chapter 24, verse 14. Now, therefore, fear the Lord and serve Him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your fathers served in the region beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. See, Joshua talks to the leaders of the Israelites, talks to the Israelite people, and he says, look, God has established something special with all of you. But you have a choice of whether or not you are going to continue to follow God. And he says, choose today who you're going to follow. You yourself make the choice. Your family make the choice. Are you going to serve the gods beyond the Jordan? Are you going to serve the gods of the people who lived in this land that you now have? Or are you going to serve God? Joshua says, as for me and my family, we will serve the Lord. An important truth for us to recognize about ourselves today. Those of you who are here this evening as Christians have a choice to make on who you and your family will serve. That does not mean that those of you who are parents of young children, that you get to decide that your children will grow up to follow God. It does mean that you as parents will get to decide whether or not you are leading them to follow God. It means that we as Christians have the opportunity every single day to wake up and decide, who do I serve? Do I serve a God who has established a unique relationship with me, or do I serve the gods of the people around me? Do I put God first, or do I put other things ahead of him? In verse 16, the people answered, far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods, for it is the Lord our God who brought us and our fathers up from the land of Egypt and out of the house of slavery, and who did those great signs in our sight and preserved us in all the way that we went and among all the peoples through whom we passed. And the Lord drove out before us all the people, the Amorites who live in the land. Therefore, we also will serve the Lord, for he is our God. Always like this, and this is like the part where I feel like oftentimes we would want to like end the movie, right? That's the end credits. If I was making a movie for Hollywood, this is the point in which I would say, okay, Joshua has made his big climatic speech. He has informed the people that they have a choice to make. They reminded the people of all of the great things God has done. And he said, choose who you're going to choose. He's let them know this is who I'm going to do. And the people say, we will follow God. If I was making a movie and I wanted to do well, that's the point in which the credits would start rolling and the music would play because everyone would be happy. And everyone would be inspired by the fact that these people all chose to follow God. But Joshua is not me. Cannot imagine having the faith that Joshua had, the understanding of humanity that Joshua has. In verse 19, Joshua said to the people, you are not able to serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions or your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you harm and consume you after having done you good. And the people said to Joshua, no, but we will serve the Lord. And Joshua said to the people, you are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen the Lord to serve him. And they said, we are witnesses. See, Joshua looked at the people and he said, here's a reality that you need to understand, that even though you say you are going to follow God, you will not follow God. As a whole, you group of people will not follow God. It's an interesting thing for us to think about. Again, there's a uniqueness at this point in history in God's relationship with the Israelites that we ourselves cannot directly relate to in this instance. And that is that God had promised to Abraham that you would have this land. And Joshua has said, we've done it, we've got the land. God has fulfilled his promise to Abraham. But if you are unfaithful to God, understand that this land will be taken away. There's a uniqueness in this moment in history in which the way in which God relates to his chosen people. It's a uniqueness, not in the sense that it is easier for us to follow God now than it was for them then, because again, we are all sinners. We all fall short of the glory of God. Paul discusses the idea that if you say that you are without sin, you are a liar. We as Christians are not special or unique in the sense that we quit sinning. Certainly not. But we live in a different era. There is a different promise that Joshua is referring to here than the promise that we have been given. See, at this point in history, the promise that the Israelites are relying upon is the promise of this land of rest. And God has made it abundantly clear to his people throughout their history with him that the establishment of this land and the retaining of this land is based upon a covenant relationship with God that is determined by the willingness of the people to follow God. And that God will protect them and protect that land as long as they are following God. And Joshua, in his wisdom, based upon the experiences that he has had in his life, based upon perhaps the relationship he has had with God, he understands that the Israelites as a whole, as a group of people, are not going to be capable of following God. For time's sake, we're not going to get into it. But if you want to take some time this week, read chapter 23 of Joshua. Chapter 23 of Joshua is kind of an extended version of this speech in chapter 24 is the way that I kind of view it, in which he kind of lists very specific things that might cause the Israelites to fall. Amongst that list is the idea that the Israelites, when they take this land, are going to eventually fall victim to the temptation to become just like everybody else in the land. Because what we need to remember is that even as the people crossed the Jordan, even though they were supposed to take and claim all of the land and remove the people that were there, they didn't. They left people behind. They left people behind who weren't following God, and Joshua in his wisdom recognizes that that is going to be a problem for the Israelites. In this moment in time when Joshua is talking to these people, before Joshua is going to die, Joshua encourages them to choose to follow God, even though he knows that as a people, they will not be able to fulfill it. The people say they will. He chastises them. They say, we will. And he says, you are witnesses against yourself. You are witnesses against yourselves. Verse 23, he said, then put away the foreign gods that are among you, and incline your heart to the Lord, the God of Israel. And the people said to Joshua, the Lord our God we will serve, and his voice we will obey. And Joshua made a covenant with the people that day and put in place statutes and rules for them at Shechem. And Joshua wrote these words in the book of the law of God. And he took a large stone and set it up there under the terebinth that was by the sanctuary of the Lord. And Joshua said to all the people, Behold, this stone shall be a witness against us, for it has heard all the words of the Lord that he spoke to us. Therefore it shall be a witness against you, lest you deal falsely with your God. And Joshua sent the people away, every man to his inheritance. You see, at this point in history, God had established a special, unique relationship with the people of Israel. A relationship that was based upon the promises of God and the faithfulness of God. Going back to Abraham, when God said, I will make you a great nation, you will have many descendants, I will give you this land. And the promise that at this point is still left to be fulfilled, that all nations will be blessed through you. You see, God's faithfulness to Abraham, God's faithfulness to his chosen people at this point in time had come with very real physical benefits that we ourselves do not directly relate to. Even though we as Christians have been grafted into this relationship with God, the promised land that we are hopeful for is not the same one. I don't know about you. You spent any time outside today? Very hot. Very, very hot. I don't know if you pay a whole lot of attention to the region around Israel and all of the conflicts and things that go on there. I am not particularly interested about trying to build my house inside that land. Because the promised land that I am hoping for, that I am looking forward to, is not a physical land for me and my family. But that was part of the promise that God made to Abraham. A physical land for him and his descendants, based upon a covenant relationship that was dependent upon them following God. Spoiler alert, Joshua was right. People of Israel are incapable of following God. Throughout the history after this period of time, you will have the Israelites in the promised land go through periods of time where they have great faith in God and periods of time where they have rejected God so much to the point where God has allowed them to be conquered by other people, and then they call out for God and God saves them, and it's just a cycle that repeats over and over and over again in the book of Judges. Why? Because Joshua was right. The people of Israel as a whole are incapable of being faithful to God, because God's standard is beyond what they as broken human beings would achieve. Because Joshua knew that they would be distracted and tempted to follow these other gods. And after they establish a king, it doesn't get a whole lot better. See, throughout most of the history, we read about the Israelites' kingdom, their time in the promised land. For the most of that time, we read about their lack of faith to God, not their faithfulness to God. Next Sunday morning, we're going to read about and discuss some of the things that go along with the results of that lack of faithfulness to God. Here in Joshua, Joshua paints this picture very clearly of a group of people who have been greatly blessed by God, who have been challenged to follow God, who have stated that they will follow God, who have been warned that if they do not follow God, there will be consequences. That is a part of the covenant that they've made with God, that they have recommitted to, that they have reestablished, that their faithfulness to God is a prerequisite for them to continue to hold this land. And Joshua is right. They fail and they cannot do it, and they face the consequences. There are certain truths, certain things that we ought to hold on to when we study this period of time. Certain things we ought to recognize about ourselves. One of the things that we ought to recognize about ourselves is that God, again, has given us choices. You choose. I choose. I make a choice for me and my family. I make a choice for the people that I'm responsible for. Adam and Eve are given a choice. Live in this perfect place. Don't eat of this one tree. Choose not to. God establishes a special covenant relationship with the people of Israel, and He gives them these promises, and He fulfills these promises, and He tells them, you have a choice. Joshua tells them, you have a choice. Follow or don't follow. But understand that there are consequences for both of them. When we as Christians fail to choose for ourselves and for our family to follow God, there are consequences. They're great consequences. We also should recognize that even though our relationship with God is different, in the sense of the hope that we have is based upon something better, as the writer of Hebrews would suggest, that our covenant is established on a better covenant, that we ought to recognize within ourselves the fact that we are wholly incapable of following God without sin. It's not a point in which we can be. I will always be a sinner. Thankfully, I live on the other side of the cross, where God has established this forgiveness that the Israelites hoped for, that we have seen. The Israelites looked forward to the completion of the third promise God made to Abraham, and we look back and see that He did it on the cross. And so my relationship with God is not fully based upon my ability to flawlessly follow His teachings and His commandments, even though that is what my goal is. But that I rely upon the forgiveness that He offered at the cross. And that's where we all are. It's where we all ought to be. The people of Israel are at a time relying upon a promise for a certain aspect, a certain part of their relationship with God that was based very much on a physical blessing of a promised land. That God said, I will protect and you will have a remnant there as long as you are faithful. Again, next Sunday we'll look at the results of their lack of faithfulness to God. Next Sunday we'll read about them being at different rivers. Rivers of the lands of the people who conquered them and removed them from the promised land because of their faithlessness. See, the Bible tells us that God is always faithful. He always keeps his promise. It is we, his followers, who fail to be faithful to him. But every day we have a choice. Every moment we have a choice. Choose who you will follow. But for me and my family, we will choose to serve the Lord. If you have not chosen to follow God, you have not connected yourself to that branch, if you've not been grafted into the promises that God has given through baptism, now is an opportune time to take care of that. If you have struggled and need encouragement to try to choose again to follow God to the best of your ability, now is an opportunity to seek help and encouragement as we stand and we sing this song.